That was a really great presentation, David, and thank you very much for that. And I really like the way you were talking about IT being an enabler for the business, because it's often, sometimes rightly, sometimes wrongly, seen as a disenabler for the business. When we talk about transformation or business transformation, is one thing I often say, IT can be your biggest enabler for transformation, and it can be your biggest disenabler. And a lot of that is to do, quite frankly, with the partnership approach between IT and the business, which can be two ways. Another thing that made me think about while I was listening to you, David, was this concept called single version of the truth, right? You often get people say, we want a single version of the truth. And in reality, my experience is you have multiple versions of the single version of the truth, depending on who you're asking and which platform you're on. And that also linked to another comment. You've got technical infrastructure and what I call functional infrastructure. So you can have, you talked about 2 ERP platforms. So you can have, that's effectively 2 technical infrastructures for that ERP. But you can have one technical instance of an ERP. But you can have multiple, what I call functional instances. I know that's not a technical term, but it means that the business is using them totally differently in different parts of the business. So even though it's technically one infrastructure, functionally it is not. And that's the linkage with the business, which is very, very important. So lots came out, lots of thoughts and questions came out of that. Anyway, with that in mind, thank you very much again, David. Appreciate that. Can we just ask to come up here, Stephen Byers? Hi, Stephen. Stephen is from the Georgetown University Medical Center, and I'll let Stephen introduce himself in a second. John Marshall from the Shared Services Leadership Coalition. Hi, John. And Mike Russell from Virginia's Community Colleges. Hi, Mike. So this is going to be, I think we've got about, 42 minutes, an interactive discussion, so we will take questions from anyone. So think of questions. It's a broad discussion topic on unlocking operational efficiencies in higher education. So the focus here is higher ed. So let's try and focus on higher education to some extent, although I know that, John, you've been involved in public sector in general, so we'll talk a little bit more about that. And actually, I want to talk a little bit about this thing called shared services and what that really means versus back office business transformation. But before we do that, would you guys please introduce yourself, a bit of background on who you are and your expertise in this area and what you're going to present. So Mike.
Right, so I'm Mike Russell. I work for the Virginia Community College System. I've been with them for just over a year. I've been in higher ed for about 30 years, though. I've been CIO at multiple institutions, a couple of community colleges, urban research, masters, small liberal arts, so pretty much across the gamut in higher ed.
John?
John Marshall. I'm founder and CEO of the Shared Services Leadership Coalition, which is an industry-sponsored and good government group-sponsored coalition that's advocating legislation to transform the federal government's infrastructure through shared services business models. My career has spanned over 30 years, mostly working in the federal space in a series of positions in the government and with consulting and IT firms supporting the government. And so I'm here to really bring a slightly different perspective, but with a lot of common themes and lessons learned, I think, that will resonate within the higher ed sector as well.
Hi, Stephen.
So I'm Steve Byers. I'm the director of the Georgetown University Medical Center Shared Resources. I feel a little bit like a charlatan here. I'm not a business or a process person. My background is 30 years of science. In 2005, I took over the shared resource activities at Georgetown University and have tried to move some way towards, as you say, unlocking efficiencies within that system.
Actually, with that, I'm going to start with you, Steve, because I noticed your question to David about, research and IT, etc. So, when you say shared in your environment, what do you mean exactly? So we're not talking about shared data centers in your environment, are we? Or what are we talking about in your role?
Right. So, Sidney Brenner, who won the Nobel Prize about 10 years ago, basically said that transformation in science and research is driven by new technology, new money, and new ideas, probably in that order, right? And so one of the issues with scientific advancement in a university environment is that much of the technology that's needed cannot be supported by individual investigators. So it behooves us to actually provide that sort of support in a centralized way, so that we provide that technology aspect of the continuum. So providing new technology that's shared by multiple investigators, and in our case, multiple institutions, as well as outsourcing to the business community. So that's what we mean by shared services,
Okay.
and ranging from recruitment and consenting of patients for clinical trials to all of the omics types of technologies, genomics, for example, personalized medicine technologies.
Very, very interesting. Mike, what is shared in your environment?
So right now we have a lot of single systems, if you will. So we have a single ERP, but it's run at 23 institutions, so it's run 23 different ways,
Right.
with lots of shadow systems and that kind of thing. So for us, it's really how to get people to standardize business processes, standardize technologies, kind of come at it from the back office, although there's a huge IT support role, to roll out more efficient operations.
And actually, John, I'm going to just ask you, how would you define, if you don't mind me asking you, in your experience, what is shared services? Can you in a couple of sentences, define it in the terms of what the public sector is trying to do in your experience?
Well, it's the definition has morphed through the years. A few years ago, it was strictly on the IT supporting common services. And the philosophy is buy or build once, use many. The way we're looking at it now is it's not just the technology, it's the organization, the process, the labor, everything that's about delivering the service. And it speaks to both the common back office services, where we typically focus initially, HR, financial management, acquisition, IT, and so forth. But it's also in the government common mission support or mission-related services, like geospatial or benefits administration, or something that a number of agencies may have in common, similar requirements, similar services, but not necessarily every agency in the government would use it. We're looking to consolidate government-wide shared services that are used by all agencies into a smaller number of platforms, and get all the agencies into those. But for these other mission-related services, it might be 5 or 10 agencies who have a common need who would co-invest and operate a shared service together.
And
So it's pretty broad.
Yeah. And the scope is significant. The potential scope is significant. And again, shared services, to use this term again, we're really talking about, just to dwell on that for a second, we're really talking about business back office transformation, making things more efficient, more effective, and better service. That's what I call the triple benefit: efficiency, effectiveness, which is service level, and control, visibility. And you can expand those things to include other areas, but you can achieve all three if you do this thing right. They are not mutually exclusive. In fact, if they do become mutually exclusive, you will fail. So if you implement a shared services type of model and you just look about efficiency and cutting costs, and you don't deal with the effectiveness in the service, you will fail. You'll congratulate yourself about reducing costs for a little bit, and then the business will set up its shadow IT organizations and its shadow functions, and before you know it, your cost structure is harder than it was before, and you wonder why. So they are all related, but it is broader than just, so shared services is about really transformation of your entire back office in that sense. Now, in higher education, just to switch back to the panel for a second, Mike, we were talking about it's a relatively new concept in higher education. What are some of the challenges that you see around implementing these types of models in IT or in broader higher ed?
Right. Well, I mean, the culture is one of individualism. I mean, from a faculty member's perspective to just the way an institution operates, right? Everybody looks at, I've got a president, and he kind of sets the tone, and everybody kind of marches to that tune, if you will. So when you take 23 different perspectives in our case and say, well, wait a minute, this isn't really efficient, and we've got 23 HR offices, 23 purchasing efforts, and let's figure out how to streamline and pull these things together. It's a challenging conversation. You have a lot of people that jump right in, and it's like, yeah, this makes a lot of sense, but you have a lot that don't. And so it's really a persuasion game.
And Steve, how have you seen at your university in terms of
I would echo that. With many academic environments, and mine certainly the case, they tend to be risk averse. And transformational change tends to take place on the edge, what I refer to as the edge of chaos. Not really chaos,
yes.
but basically you have to have some sort of degree of acceptance of risk, which is given in the business community, it's not given in the university community. I have to deal with probably 100, 200 individual customers, i.e. laboratories or clinicians, each of whom functions like a small business, except that they don't run like small businesses, but they want to control everything. And one of the challenges is trying to have them give up control. And I think that step by step, we're actually moving toward having them do that it's much easier to have somebody else do something that they're an expert at, and then try and do it yourself and set up and duplicate effort multiple times.
Actually, it just reminds me when it's quite a few years back now, but I went to Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, which is up on the hill in Berkeley, and we were doing a review of HR. And I thought, naive old private sector guy at the time, I thought it can't be that bad. It's one campus, right? I mean, I've been doing global shared services and implementing stuff in India to support the UK and Singapore, and I was so wrong. I mean, walking around the campus, it was like going from one different planet to another as you went from one building. They were completely different structures and organizations within one campus, and it was a real lesson. And so you had to apply the same lessons you'd apply almost to a different culture and country within the same campus, which was something I really learned there, and we've developed since then. In terms of public sector, again, broadly, generally speaking, how do you see how shared services is viewed, John, in terms of
the challenges and
yes.
and the value proposition?
Yes.
Let me add something.
And anything uniquely you've seen in public sector versus private sector as well, from your own experience?
As far as the challenges, I think they're all the same. I think government, public sector, and I've had a little exposure in higher ed.
Yeah.
It's harder to realize change. You have the profit motive. You can hire and fire in the private sector, which you really can't do so well in government and higher ed. So the incentives are working more with you in the commercial world. If I could add one more point to the value proposition we were talking about a few minutes ago, is in the federal government, it's all about cost savings and service improvements, but it's actually more than that now. We have an enormous outdated crumbling infrastructure, IT infrastructure and service infrastructure throughout business and architecture throughout the government. And we've seen through the OPM data breach and other breaches that it's incredibly vulnerable and wasteful, and it's duplicative, and it needs to be completely re-architected. We have some other, and shared services should be part of that vision going forward. Modernized vision of business needs, and with shared services as a core part of the strategy for modernization going forward. We also have some other legislative drivers. We have an act of Congress a few years ago. It's trickling down into the higher ed. I know you're getting familiar with it. The Data Transparency and Accountability Act. It's all about transparency. We also have cybersecurity legislation. Shared services can be a force multiplier in achieving the aims of these other legislative drivers, simply because having a downsized infrastructure with a smaller number of platforms that are standardized and more hardened targets and fully cyber secure and with standards for data exchange, you're going to have improved transparency and cybersecurity as you move forward in shared services. So shared services is really being seen as a force multiplier for these other related objectives of government.
Yeah, it's been seen but it's also been seen as a threat, right? I mean, within the organization, it's a threat to change. So specifically in higher education, again, as you move forward with your initiative, how did you try and you talked about people being in opposition, which is normal, but how did you try and sell the change? Was it forced on? Was it collaborative? Was it a mixture of both? How did you do it?
It was more of put something together in terms of a structure and let people opt in, right? So we're trying to prove models, especially around the IT area. We were lucky in that we had some catalysts too. We had some data security incidents, right? So
Right.
what we did was we put together a shared service around security, right? And what we did was, obviously, if you have one institution with somebody trying to maintain security part-time and wearing 5 other hats, they're not going to be able to keep up with a team of 5 or 6 people who do this full-time every day, right? And then what we would do is we'd allow the institutions to opt in and then start supporting it financially, and let their security person either transition into that group or transition away. We've done the same thing for CIOs and CTOs for some leadership for certain institutions. We've also kind of been leading an effort to do infrastructure as a service for people. They don't want to provision stuff out of the cloud. Some do, some don't. But at the end of the day, what we did was we got out of the data center business because we were located where there were some very good colo facilities. So we moved all of our enterprise systems into colo facilities, and we're doing that for DR as well. And what we're doing is we're asking the institutions to get out of the data center business and follow us into the colo center. So it's more of that kind of thing. I think we're more trying to use carrots than sticks.
So, I mean, I've asked a few questions, but if anyone has a question, please just put your hand up at any point and we'll take the question for the panelists. So has anyone got a question right now? If not, start thinking. Yeah, great, excellent. One question in the middle here. Microphone, thank you.
When you're moving the data centers or trying to get into the co-locations, are you therefore sharing a contract to do that as a method?
Right, so the way we did that was we did an RFI, so we had multiple providers and we signed contracts with several of them, right? So we chose one to put our big ERP and distance ed systems into, but those contracts are available to all the institutions. So obviously we'd like them to come to the same place we are, for either our primary or our DR sites. But there are other regional efforts that would meet their needs, and we would have them go there just as well.
I have a follow-up on that. In doing that, so you have the common contract vehicle. When you get down to the task order level, did you construct a template, so that the terms and conditions that you want to move forward, where each time an organization comes in and they're using it, they just reuse that task order, republishing it, for instance?
Right, yeah, that's basically what it is. I mean, and the way they charge for co-location centers is basically electrical use, right? So they watch what your electrical draw is, and that in square footage is a simple mathematical calculation, and they charge you. So realistically, even if they wanted to move into our cage, we'd let them do that, right? And we can see what the delta is between whatever the draw and the space stays the same, so we can figure out what to charge. So, did that answer the question?
Yes, because it was mostly having the contract and then getting the right terms and conditions, so that not every it's the herding of the cats, so to speak, that you're doing. You're not going to get everyone to do a consolidated buy, but you can make all the buys look the same, so that later down the road, when you move them onto the same rail, so to speak, it's more easily accomplished. And it sounds as though that's where you've gone in the construct of the using of the contracts in that way, rather than just putting them out there, create your own task order off of it, but rather use a common task order where possible.
Right, and that was basically because of the difference in the size of these institutions, right? They go anywhere from a couple thousand to, 70,000 at a different, so the difference in what they would need going into colo is totally different. Like I said, some of them are small enough they could just come into our space and it's not a big deal. Others want to go in and have their own, and that's fine too.
So Steve, just turning to you, how long have you been at this sharing initiative in your university, and what benefits have you seen so far in terms of whatever, money or efficiency or better programs or better outputs? How far are you into this program, firstly?
We've been into it quite a long time. I think one of the dilemmas that you face in the medical research environment is the dwindling NIH dollars, the funding rates of decreased approximately 15% over the last 3 or 4 years. What's quite remarkable, and one of the reasons that we think that we're being quite successful, is that even though the funding of our customers has gone down by approximately 15%, the activity of the shared resources in terms of chargebacks has gone up. It's doubled pretty much every year for about 3 years, and now it's going up at a rate of about 10% a year in the face of decreasing funding, which tells us that investigators are realizing it's more cost effective to actually use shared services than it is to actually try and independently fund it on their own dollar. So that's, I think, one thing that we've seen that has changed. One of the challenges is maintaining the interest of the university in actually supporting the infrastructure that's required for these shared services. And I think if there was something I would do differently from the beginning, it would be that I would have got in front of the board, the university board, to make sure that they understood what the efficiencies that they could unlock as a consequence of investing in shared services. So that's one thing I would change.
That's actually a great point. I mean, again, think of any questions while I'm answering. Investment. That's a word that just means, it's translated in higher ed and a lot of organizations to money, right? You're asking for an investment, therefore you're asking me for money, therefore you're asking to increase your costs. So the business case has to be, back to it has to be clear, because you can't just ask for money without telling them what the organization's going to get back, right? How did you do that? Did you get investment dollars, or did you fund it out of budget?
So our institution has a very poor capital budget allotment. We have 3 campuses with a total budget of about $300 million. Our capital budget is $1.25 million a year. So in order to stretch that, we apply for outside agencies. And one of the ways in which we've managed to make that work is that by forming consortia with other institutions. And whenever we get an instrumentation grant from the NIH or NSF, invariably those that are successful are those in which we've spread the use. So Johns Hopkins and us will share it, for example. So that's one way. We're in the process of trying to figure out how the university can change the way it allocates capital expenditures. We bounce around from operating to capital leases depending on the bond status of the university. And that, for a scientist, that's really a long way from reality. And from the bottom line perspective, it doesn't seem to make any sense to us. Yeah. So there's a lot of that. That's one of the reasons that I think we need to be talking to senior leaders at the university and people that actually oversee it, for example, the board.
David.
Just curious, how much of your success sharing with that community would you attribute to the fact that you're one of them? You're a scientist. You're an honest broker in their terms.
I don't know. My administrative assistant is here, so maybe Liz could comment on that. Whether so I think that one of the mistakes that people make is that they assume that if you're a scientist that you don't really have any business sense or financial sense. That's probably not true. The scientists are pretty smart people. The clinicians are very smart people. They're well aware of these business machinations. But you need to be able to persuade them that there is a benefit. And one way is to basically say that why would you do this yourself when you can give it to a centralized IT component, for example. And one is persuasion and the other is marketing. Letting people know that these entities actually exist. And that is much harder than you would think, even within a university.
Yeah, actually the whole sales and marketing thing for back office people is a bit of a shock sometimes. When I say back office, I mean HR, finance, IT, procurement. All of a sudden you've got to start marketing this stuff. I mean, a lot of what you did at the City of Houston is selling and marketing, right? Business development, getting you scope. It's a completely different ballgame to the traditional way of running a back office. And it has to be, because that's how you get the efficiencies. I mean, again, in terms of the public sector in general, John, how are you seeing that? And one of the things we've experienced in the public sector is that when you try and introduce a measures and metrics framework, a proper measures and metrics framework, as opposed to a tick the box, we do it, there's a lot of opposition. So how are you seeing that in the public sector?
The art of persuasion works differently on different stakeholder groups. And when you're selling at an enterprise level, the notion of doing shared services, it's transformation, it's enterprise-wide. The business case is more driven by cost savings. The farther down you go the food chain, the more it becomes about what's in it for me, for the end user.
Yeah.
And so it's about the investigators and the other members of the academic community, and how is my life going to change, and how is it going to be better, and can someone speak to me in my language that I understand and make that real to me. When we're dealing with Congress in trying to persuade them to enact legislation to drive shared services, which has been a missing ingredient in our success.
Right.
It's about the cost savings, because they've got enormous pressure to meet sequestration targets in the budget. They also have an interest in these other pieces of legislation, the Data Act and cybersecurity legislation. And if we can persuade them that shared services is part of the solution to those other objectives of theirs, then it's another couple of reasons, policy reasons, for them to get behind it. So it all depends who you're talking to, where they are in the food chain and what their hot buttons are. They all have different ones.
Actually, we helped the government of New Brunswick implement a new shared services model back in 2009 through 2012, and there was a lot of that going on. So I would actually attend a lot of the meetings with the ministers and the deputy ministers.
Yeah.
It was really exciting, fascinating stuff. And then, of course, you're right. When you got to the sort of the more junior staff, the clerical, the supervisors, you had to sell a different story completely.
And the one that I left out, that may be the most important one as far as being with you or against you, is the mid-management tier.
Yes.
That stands to lose.
They're the toughest group.
Yeah.
The mid-management group is always the toughest group.
So you have to be very persuasive with them.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I found, and I define what you said interesting, and it was certainly part of the process that we went through, is that there are actually two P's that sometimes you face. One is the practical P, does it make sense? But the other one is the political P, what's the implications to the organization? And I think you've got to figure out, when you're talking about marketing or selling or anything, how do you balance those practical and political P's? And so I'd be interested in having anybody share how they balance those two P's that I'm fighting all the time in my organization.
Political and practical. And so I alluded to the political before, which is to get to the highest level possible initially to make that argument that shared services investment is worthwhile. I think political P is also having people in the right place that have a high social quotient. When you're dealing with people that are not necessarily in your field, that are not necessarily understanding exactly what it is you're talking about. If you come at it from a cardiologist's perspective, that ain't going to work. You have to come at it from a political perspective, and that delicacy. And approaching these things in a way that is humane. You can't just stand up there and yell. Yeah.
Actually, one expression I've used, it's one of those expressions that's exaggerated, but there is some truth in it. To implement something like this, you need to be politically aware, but not political. Now, what I mean is you do need to be a bit political too. But if you're too political, people will find you out and they will mistrust you. So if they think you've got some other agenda, they won't trust you. But if you're not politically aware, you'll be talking to the wrong people in the wrong way. So that's just a thought as your question. You guys got any additional thoughts on the politics of this in higher education or in government in general?
For us, our strategy is usually find the people who have already bought in, right? And instead of us trying to sell the programs, we let them try and sell the programs for us. So, we have a couple of thought leaders in the presidencies, right? And they are kind of leading the charge, and everybody watches them. And when they move, critical mass a lot of times comes right behind them. So that's kind of our strategy.
One other device that we're considering and putting into the legislation we're proposing is a share and savings component, where if an organization really gets behind shared services and implements it and realizes the savings, and we can measure those savings, let that agency share, take a sliver of it, 25% or whatever of that realized gain,
Right.
and redeploy it to what the agency thinks are under-resourced mission purposes. So maybe half or more would go to the Treasury for deficit reduction. Some portion of it could go back to the agency for what it thinks is important, and part of that could be used for bonuses for the employees who are really putting their shoulder to the effort and getting it done in the trenches.
Any other question here?
As I understand it, the argument for shared services now, especially in IT, is that by coming together, you can do a lot more things at scale than individuals can do. So can you imagine a time when Google and Amazon, who have much more scale than we do, can do things so cheaply that the need for, say, a university to have a centralized computing facility goes away because we can allow all the individuals to work with third-party vendors more cheaply?
Great question. I'm not going to answer that straight away. I'm going to Who wants to take that?
I would say yes.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, one of the things that we've done going into our disaster sites now is we don't want to have a whole bunch of equipment sitting idle most of the time. So we're figuring out how to provision things in the cloud so that we pay as we use them rather than, putting all that infrastructure in place. So,
I'm going to say something about IT for a second. I think it's truer in IT, but once you get into finance and HR and these other processes that are intertwined with the day-to-day operation of the organization, it's much harder. Or just look at it, business process outsourcing as the example of that, right? So the business process outsourcers came with this value proposition. We've got scale, right? Give us multi-tower business processes. And that hasn't played out like that. And it hasn't played out like that because it's not as easy as that. Why has it worked in manufacturing for cars, for example? Because generally speaking, when I'm simplifying this way too much, but if you're manufacturing a car, right, you have a design model, you have the parts, you say, here's the design, go and produce 100 of those, and when you're done, give them back to me. I don't really care how you do it. You can't do that when you get into finance and HR and procurement because you're interacting on a day-to-day basis with the buyer, the user, the employee. So the principle I agree with, but the end scale, that's why. So I think that's more appropriate in IT than others. The principle's still correct though, but it's just not as easy to achieve in those other areas. And sometimes you've got to be careful because you actually have to have certain of the processes embedded in the organization. So just an additional comment I thought I would add to that. Very good question. Any other questions from the floor? No. In terms of the benefits achieved in monetary terms, I heard earlier on talking about cost avoidance versus strict cost versus what you had a couple of other categorizations. How are you showing that? And again, from my experience at GNB, Government of New Brunswick, we showed direct cost reductions, cost avoidance, and other benefits. I can't remember what the categories were. Because you have to, especially in public sector. How have you guys done that? Or have you not got to that yet and it's been strict dollars?
Right. So that's been a real challenge for us because we're so distributed that trying to figure out where all those shadow systems are is challenging, let alone what they cost. So even if you can get them all into a shared services model, we weren't sure what we were paying for them in the first place, so it's really hard to quantify, any savings. We could hopefully come up with what they cost once we've deployed them into a new model.
Yeah, reconciling the business case to the budget. Try doing that. I mean, not just that's a statement for private sector as well as public sector, but even more so in the public sector. Reconcile your business case to the budget, because somebody's going to ask you where that money went, whether you like it or not. So you're going to have to talk to it pretty well at some point in higher education. Oh, we saved $10 million. Well, your budget's gone up. Where is it? You have to be able to answer that question somehow. So it's tough. I'm not giving you the answer, I'm just giving you the problem. Steve, any thoughts on that?
So we have a quite an enlightened chief business officer in the medical center, and she and I have worked together in basically attributing activities to shared services. So we're about 50% subsidized, I imagine, by the university. So we can track each user back to the external support that they use. So even though that $10 million grant didn't all support the shared resources, we can say that that $10 million grant wouldn't have been funded if it weren't for the activity of the shared resources. So it's really, that's on this side of the equation. So the debt is on this side of the equation, but if it weren't for this debt, we wouldn't have a good deal of this. Yeah. So that's one thing that we've managed to do.
Yeah, when you get into cost reduction, it's really about, to use your word, activities. If you're making things more productive, you're increasing productivity, ultimately you're making things more efficient, you're releasing a capacity to do something else. Now what you do with that capacity is how you do or do not monetize it. And you can monetize it by reducing the cost of something, i.e. people or technology or facilities or whatever it might be, or you can allow that resource to do something value added that you can talk about, or you can leave it sitting there doing nothing, which is very dangerous because then you end up with your shadow organizations.
Or you can cure a disease or make a major scientific discovery, which is very
exactly,
difficult.
That's the value side of it, yes.
So it's part of the mission of a university.
Yeah.
We have those challenges in the government, and you can just imagine with the scale that we're dealing with how hard it is to get your arms around that. All the agencies have non-standard systems, and so getting scorekeeping in place is just an enormous challenge. We actually have one success story in government where one business line has been pretty well fully consolidated. That's payroll. It actually started in 1983, and in 2009, the Office of Personnel Management declared victory. This is done. It's all down to 4 government-wide payroll providers now. And the savings have been estimated at somewhere around $2 billion. That was in a business case developed by OPM. Now, we've estimated the potential savings, if we were to optimize across the whole government, is around $50 billion or so. So we're talking about enormous opportunity, but very hard to do the scorekeeping piece.
Oh yeah, the opportunities in public sector and higher education are huge. You don't need to spend too much time doing it. It's just how you get it done. Actually, on payroll, it's interesting. The University of California, the UC Path project, you're aware of that?
Yeah.
I mean, they're putting up a new center down near Riverside. I know you've been down there, Omar, which is going live over the next year or two, I think, which is a new payroll for the whole UC system. That has not been easy. If you talk to those guys, that has not been easy, but they're doing it.
Yeah.
And in fact, next week I was mentioning it to you, Mike, next week there's a University of California, California State University, California Community Colleges conference in Riverside. So the good news is, and I'm sure it's happening to some extent, everyone's talking. The bad news potentially is the talking, you've got to actually start doing something. The good news is there are things happening in this space, but in some of the research I've seen, the payback so far in the public sector broadly is less than in the private sector, excuse me. Not a surprise given some of the change things, but it's still positive, so it's a start of a long journey. Any other questions from the floor? Yes?
Well, it goes back to some of what was being shared here, especially when John brought up shared and savings. Because the constructs that you've been articulating here are like between the government and these large state systems where you have multiple universities, and in universities you have multiple colleges. Those colleges are just like bureaus inside of departments. So it seems as though there's a great deal of crossover, especially where the potential for the shared and savings as articulated by John could be effective. I'm wondering if that's been realized in any of these university efforts, a similar kind of construct where you've already approached it, succeeded, or where, and also where the bleed over can be between what John's organization is doing legislatively and what could be done in state legislation.
Well, I'm going to give you a straight answer. I'll ask the panel in a second. The answer is yes. There are real examples of real benefits at the university level with real savings being achieved. Some at the regents level, so be it the University of Iowa Regents system or the University of California system, and there are others. And actually, we have a lot of data and we do a lot of research around that, so there are a lot of good examples. But compared to the private sector, it's still relatively new. But to answer your question, yes, there are, with specific case studies and specific numbers. So if you're interested, we can take that outside. But from your experience, are you seeing have you come across outside of your universities or even, success stories that you guys leverage? Oh yeah, well they did this at this university, And they come along. So, for example, Omar, I understand you went down to the UC Riverside recently at the invitation of UC Riverside to speak to them about your story. Do you guys use those examples in your universities of other universities' success stories? Judging by the face expressions, not a lot so far. But any thoughts around that? Is this obviously something you could do?
Well, I think I have one that I'm going to start using.
There we go, David, absolutely.
Exactly.
Yes.
I mean, that was eye-opening for me, especially some of the metrics and that. So I can't say that I have anything right now, but maybe I do.
The question is very important because it's so often you can't do that here. And then if you can say, well, they did it. Oh, who are they? What are they in? Oh, they're University of so-and-so. Really? Then people start listening. So it is important as you move forward with this, examples.
And we're finding lots of that. It's very important, very helpful in making the case in the public sector to point to other success stories in the global government community. And in the U.S. state and local government community, there's an awful lot of activity out there. The state of Ohio has done some great things. The New York City Transit Authority actually has done some very exciting things, very impressive things. The UK, Australia, New Zealand, a number of other Western countries are out there doing what we need to be doing here.
The UK is a good, being from the UK originally. They've done some really good things. They've had some real mistakes.
Yeah.
And one of the things the good thing about it is the mistakes are so public. In the private sector, if you make a mistake in shared services, you don't go and announce it and send out a press release about it. in the public sector, somebody will announce it and send a press release out about it. So you actually hear about the failures, and there's some really good case study failures in the UK public sector, which actually give credit to the UK government. They're learning from and then they're continuing the Gerson Lehman stuff and the follow-up to all of that. It's really interesting.
Yeah. Shared Services Canada is another good example.
Shared Services Canada is another one, yeah. Especially in Shared Services in Canada, we do have a Canadian in the room. Any other Canadians in the room? Yeah, Shared Services at the provincial level is also very, very hot in Canada. Steve, any other thoughts on that?
I think for me, any inspiration that we get is generally from the private sector. So the way those things are managed, how excess capacity is managed. And we've sort of figured out that we can sell off our excess capacity to the private sector, for example.
Right.
So most of the inspiration has come from that direction. There are a few other entities. Vanderbilt has a really good shared services operation. And that's something that we've been looking at for the last 6 or 7 years.
Okay, well, any other questions?
I'd just like to say, I think that the one thing that the higher education and the public sector has to be willing to do is bring people in from the private sector that has that expertise and experience and utilize those resources. They bring them in and listen to those types of past experiences. It's easy to alienate someone who's coming in with new ideas because your culture is not ready to accept them. And so I think, I've been lucky in the city of Houston because I had an executive champion who said, change shall go forth and we will change. And so, but I think that other institutions have to be willing to accept people like me inside of their organizations that have that type of experience and expertise if you're going to bring that change forward.
Okay, with that, I think we're out of time because when that red light starts flashing, I think that means I'm out of time before somebody jumps on me and says you're out of time. With that, thank you very much to the panelists for that session, Steve, John, Mike, appreciate it. And if you're hanging around, hopefully, if you guys want to just exchange conversations and business cards, sounds like you've got somebody who's going to be coming to visit your university very soon. Thank you very much for your attendance. I hope that was useful. And thank you to the Bloomberg team for hosting this session in these offices. So, good travels, everyone. Thank you very much.
The audience here and the audience online. First of all, I want to echo what Phil said. Thank you to the speakers. Thank you for the audience for making the time. And thank you to Chazey for underwriting this. The other thing, as I mentioned, this is an East Coast, West Coast series. So our next event is November 10th in Santa Monica, California. That event's also going to be live streamed, so I encourage everybody in the room, everybody on the live stream to sign up for it. Similar themes, but different speakers, and should be a really interesting session. So thank you again, and have a great day.